So we are continuing our series in Esther, okay? And Esther is an interesting book. Many of you might have come across it, and you might know it from this little phrase, "for such a time as this." Esther was the little Hebrew girl who became queen for such a time as this. And that's good. There's a lot more to Esther than simply "for such a time as this." Esther as a book, if you've missed the last couple of weeks, is actually quite interesting because it's quite a comedy, actually. It's almost like a Hebrew pantomime. It's full of exaggerated kinds of things and sort of ridiculous situations. That doesn't mean that the events of Esther are not to be considered reliable historically, any more than the fact that Hamilton has humor in it as a musical means that Alexander Hamilton never existed and the American Revolution didn't happen and King George is a complete fiction of Manuel Miranda's imagination. Right? So just because it's funny and exaggerated doesn't mean it's historically unreliable. And we've seen this sort of pantomime work its way out. There's this, we had this massive empire. Never mind. Zeke, do you think we could pull a map up? Do you reckon? Let's go to the third one. So this is the Assyrian Empire, then the Babylonian Empire, and then it goes to the Persian Empire. Okay, so this is during the time of the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire is like the world power. It controls what would come to be called the Silk Roads, the massive trade routes between Asia, Africa, and Europe. And there's this massive empire, and there's Xerxes. And he's like, yeah, he's the guy, right? And he's having this big party, over a series of months, and his wife actually given all of his power. He asked his wife Vashti, the queen, to do something. She's like, no. And so she doesn't get to be queen anymore. That's a bit of an overreaction, right? And Xerxes doesn't know what to do, and so in a sort of yes minister sort of way, he gets his bureaucrats around him like, "What? I'm furious. What do I do?" And they're like, "Well, Vashti can't be queen because if she stays queen, then then the whole empire is going to collapse. It'll create disorder." And so he boots her out, and then he starts to miss her because he makes a rash decision. And it's like, "Oh, Vashti," And so his bureaucrats see this happening, and they're like, "We need to get in here before Xerxes makes a bad idea." So instead of doing what you would normally do in an empire and finding a queen from one of the Persian noble families and making sure that you're politically allying yourselves with different parts of your empire and all that sort of thing, they're like, "Dude, Xerxes, have a beauty contest and the hottest girl can be your new queen." And they can all spend a night with you. Which creates the impression that Xerxes is this stallion of a man. However, it also has this double-edged sort of thing, like maybe Xerxes is a bit less potent than one might suggest. And actually what they're trying to do is just find someone, that does it for Xerxes, right? And so we have this seemingly omnipotent king, emperor, of this massive empire who is actually quite impotent, can't make simple decisions, and perhaps can't rise to the occasion, and needs his bureaucrats to keep him together and to keep this facade of this empire. And so there's also this sort of mockery of the nations. One of the reasons that Esther is a comedy is because God scoffs at the nations. Nations rise, nations fall, and we all think they're a really big deal, but the word of the Lord stands forever. God looks at the nations and laughs, the psalmist says over and over and over again. He scoffs at them. They're nothing. And so what we're seeing is the Persian Empire and Xerxes aren't quite as big of a deal as perhaps, we might think. Which also means for us, China, Russia, America, our own government, take it easy, guys. Now, that's something I think Britain gets pretty well because you've had your big empire and it's contracted. So, so I think Britain kind of gets that a little bit better maybe than some others do, which is good. All right, so there's also this other question. We went through these series of maps real quick, so I'm kind of bringing you up to speed. There's a question at the time of the writing of Esther, who is a real Jew? Who really is a part of God's people? And that's a question that's been asked all the way from the time of the patriarchs. Abraham's offspring, well, is it Isaac or Ishmael? It's Isaac. Okay, Isaac has Jacob and Esau. Is it Jacob or Esau? It's Jacob. All right, and then there's the going down into slavery, then coming up into the land, and then there's King Saul, who's a bit of a bummer of a king. And then there's King David. Yay, King David's great. King Solomon. Yay, pretty great. And then after King Solomon, because he was only pretty great, the kingdom splits. And then there's the northern kingdom of Israel with 12 tribes. And then there's the southern kingdom of Judah with 2 tribes. But they've got Jerusalem and the temple. Who are the real Jews here? The majority who have their thing, or the minority around Jerusalem and the Davidic king and the worship of the temple. And then there comes the question after there's sin in Israel, and the Assyrians come and conquer the northern kingdom of Israel, and they scatter the Jewish people who lived there around their empire, and then there's the Babylonians who conquer the southern kingdom of Judah and scatter the Jewish people who were living there and carry off the best and the brightest and the most handsome and beautiful back to Babylon to serve in their own courts. Who are the real Jews? Because God's promise to Abraham is that his descendants would live in the land. So if we're in the land, we're the ones who are the real Jews. We have God's favor. Well, what about all those exiles? Well, no, if we've been exiled, we're the ones who are experiencing God's discipline, and God disciplines those he accepts as his children. So we're the real Jews. All right, so then, after the exile, King Cyrus, the first Persian king, lets people go back to their home nations and rebuild their capitals and go back to their worshiping systems. That included the Jewish people. So now who are the real Jews? The people who go back to Jerusalem to rebuild it? And what about if people stay in Babylon, stay in Persia, stay in the place in which they were exiled to? Are they sort of real Jews? So there's this question. And Esther is a time where actually who is a real Jew is quite important. And now we're going to learn a little bit about Mordecai. We're going to have quite a chunk today, but we're going to try and hit it faithfully, but also quickly, efficiently enough. So chapter 2, verse 19. Bearing in mind, you've got this issue of world governments, like big empires, that it's take it with a pinch, guys. God laughs at them. Who's a real Jewish person? There's some sketchy history throughout Judaism, and we're going to come back to that in just a moment. Now, what we know is Esther has become the queen. All right, Esther has become the queen. She won the beauty pageant, and she has become queen of Persia. So verse 19, when the virgins were assembled a second time, so this is kind of after the beauty pageant, so to speak, Mordecai, who's Esther's cousin, who also took her in as maybe a kinsman redeemer. We talked about this last week when she became an orphan as a small child. Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do, for she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the 2 officials were impaled on poles. Exciting. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. So real quickly, even though government stuff is a bit laughable and is being sort of made a caricature and a mockery of in Esther, nevertheless, serious and real stuff does happen in government. Right? So that was a little bit of pushback I got after the first sermon. It's like, hey, hold on, all this mocking of government, this is why we can't get good people in government, because it's just mocked all the time. Now you're saying that God mocks government, so it's okay to mock government. And so now we just don't get good people doing good things in government, and that's important. And actually, that's true. That is true. God's people engaged in the serious business of government however laughable it might be in comparison to God and his power and his sovereignty, is an important thing. It's important to vote. It's important to get stuck in. Maybe think about being a magistrate, or whatever else. Like all that stuff is important and good. And in this, Mordecai, who's in a position within the royal court, finds out that King Xerxes is going to, there's a plot to assassinate him, tells Esther, who tells Xerxes, and the plot is thwarted. Now, here's another interesting thing about Mordecai that we didn't talk about last week when we first got introduced to him. Not only is his name derived from the Babylonian god Marduk, who is the sort of chief god, all right, which is interesting because he's Jewish. It's not Yahweh or Elohim that he's named after. It would be some of the names of the one God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Marduk. Anyhow, in his genealogy, or not his genealogy, but we get introduced to him as a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, verse 5 of chapter 2, named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish. And though Shimei and Kish, in this immediate context, are not the ones I'm going to reference, there is this oblique reference to a Shimei and a Kish that are back in the Old Testament, who are King Saul's forebearers. Now, King Saul was not a great king, and you can read more about King Saul in 1 Samuel, chapter 15, chapters 14 and 15. And we find out that Saul was kind of made to be king, and he wasn't really ready to be king. He wasn't really who God had in mind to be king, but the Jewish people really wanted a king, like, give us a king. He's tall and strong and handsome. Let's have him, And Saul turns out to be a pretty bum king. All right, and God eventually rejects him as king. But here we have Mordecai, who's kind of being associate with King Saul. And in one sense, what God is, I think, what God is doing here in Esther is enfolding his people. And saying, yeah, normally we think of King David, but actually, you know what? We're bringing King Saul and his crew back into the fold as well. There's a lot of redemption that's going on here. Because remember, the book of Esther doesn't mention God, it doesn't mention prayer, it doesn't mention Jerusalem, it doesn't mention the land, it doesn't mention the covenant or the law or any of the things that we would say, ooh, this is critical to what it means to being a Jew. Mordecai and Esther, they're not religious Jews from what we can tell at all, which is quite interesting. And in Esther, we're folding in and saying, actually, God's people, there's a breadth to it, and we're bringing Saul and his crew in. And just because you haven't gone back to the land, you're still living in Persia, and you have these Babylonian names, actually, you're still part of the crew, and I still have a purpose. You're still part of the crew, and you still have a purpose. All right, which is important. So Mordecai, this guy who's associate to King Saul, he finds out about this plot, and he's able to thwart it, because Queen Esther is in place. Now, this is another kind of funny thing. People are like, it is kind of funny because everyone knows Mordecai's a Jew, and everyone knows that Esther is related to Mordecai, but somehow or another, nobody knows that Esther's a Jew. That's another kind of comic element here. The sort of stupidity of the royal court. The oh yeah, that penny drop should have happened for everybody, but somehow or another, Esther is able to keep it. And remember, Esther, her name is related to Ishtar, a Babylonian sort of consort of Marduk. And so what we have here in Mordecai and Esther is also something of God and his people. Right? And God has placed his people in places of close relationship to the nations. And sometimes places of privilege, whereby God is able to speak to us and give us wisdom to then relay into the world around us for its preservation and blessing. There's something there. Mordecai tells Esther, Esther tells Xerxes, and things work out okay. There's so many lessons that we could pull out of this, but we'd be in Esther for years if we... You're going to have to do that yourselves, guys. Take the little bits you're getting here, read Esther yourself, take these little chunks, and discover for yourself. Because guess what? You can. You're smart enough. You all know how to read, as far as I can tell. And if you can't, there's audio Bibles. And every single one of you are able to pray. because of Jesus, his life, death, resurrection, and ascension, each and every one of you can say, God, will you give me your Spirit's wisdom as I read this text? No one has special, exclusive access to the mind of God, saved through faith in Christ. And even then, God is gracious and merciful and gives his wisdom to those who don't even acknowledge him, like he does with Xerxes through Esther. You see the fractal emerging? Okay. So, this is all written down in the annals, which is a hilarious word. I really wish, can we call it the chronicles or the history records? I know there's two ends, but Anyway, so carry on. Chapter 3, verse 1. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha. You let me down, Mary.
Let his name be sorted out.
Yeah, right on. Haman becomes, it's getting warm. Haman becomes the real baddie, all right? Haman, son of Hammedatha, all right, we're introduced to. And this guy becomes a bad guy, and if we were Jewish people celebrating Purim, anytime Haman's name is mentioned, then everyone would shout in sort of a pantomime sort of fashion, let his name be blotted out, or cursed be Haman, all right? So it's very pantomimey. All right, so anyhow, he's the Agagite. Oh, Agagite? Was that some kind of mineral? Is this like vibranium? What's Agagite? An Agagite, say it too many times, is a descendant of a guy called Agag. And Agag was an Amalekite. And the Amalekites had a beef with the Jewish people under the reign of King Saul. There was a big dust-up. King Saul was meant to annihilate the Amalekites, leave nothing left. And what they did is they fought the Amalekites, and they're rather than leaving nothing left, let's keep the cool stuff at least. That seems like a waste. And that's what caused Saul to lose his kingship. He didn't obey the Lord. He kept the cool stuff. And he lied. He's like, no, because he goes to Samuel, who's the prophet. He's like, no, I kept the cool stuff so I can make a cool sacrifice to God. And Samuel says, God doesn't delight in sacrifices. He wants obedience. And so you've been rejected as king, and somebody else is going to take your place. And so now we have this old rivalry between Saul and Agag, the Amalekite, that's all of a sudden coming to the fore here in Esther, hundreds and hundreds of years later. Dun, dun, dun. This is So if you're a Jewish person, you're like, dang! Saul and Agag at it again. This is a chance for redemption, perhaps. We'll see. So Haman let his name be blotted out. He's an Agagite, and King Xerxes elevates him and gives him a seat of honor higher than all the other nobles. We don't really know why. He just does. And all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. So Mordecai is like, dude's an Agagite. Now, a lot of scholars be like, Mordecai's being a good Jew because they don't kneel down to any person. That's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel wouldn't do. They're not going to bend the knee. We actually don't get the sense from the text that that's Mordecai's motivation. He's like, hold on, I'm a Jew and I don't bow to anyone or anything. I mean, he doesn't even pray that we're aware of. It actually seems a little bit more like this ethnic feud, like, dude's an Agagite. I got a couple fingers for you, pal. I'm certainly not going to bow down. Certainly not going to bow down. So Mordecai doesn't do it. Now, it does happen in verse 3. The royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, why do you disobey the king's command? Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore, they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. Okay, so this is where people kind of get the instance, or get the sense that it's religious or ethnic. It's religious. Maybe not. Basically, what they're doing is they're saying, well, he's a Jew, and probably connecting it back to King Saul. There might be a religious tone to it, but that's not necessary. And that might be something that we're reading into the text because we have a certain expectation of what books of the Bible are supposed to be like. Right? What we do know is Mordecai's Jewishness, whether that be religious or like his family and he's connected to Saul somehow or another, he's not bowing down to Haman. And when Haman saw Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, verse 5, he was enraged. Again, think pantomime, comedic, steam coming out of his ears, bright red, that kind of thing. He was enraged, yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. And so Haman is so enraged, he's got genocidal lunacy. And actually, here's also the comedic thing, because Persia was a very tolerant empire. It was cool. It's like, no, go worship your gods. It's cool, whatever. Be your people, do your thing, live and let live. And so Haman's fury all of a sudden is becoming sort of contradicting of the general vibe of the empire. So in the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, not like the cars, okay, but just one S. All right, where to go? The pure, P-U-R, that is the lot. So think of dice, right? The lot was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month, and the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. When Haman said to Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all of the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. And I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So the king took his signet ring from his finger, gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." Now you'll notice that Haman doesn't actually tell Xerxes that it's the Jewish people. He just says, there's a people. Right? And these people, they're basically social terrorists. They're not going around killing people or blowing stuff up or anything else. They're social terrorists. They refuse to behave like everyone else in the empire. And their refusal to behave like everyone else in the empire is a social concern for you. You will not be able to keep your power. Your potency is challenged by these people who refuse to behave the same way everybody else does. You actually need to get rid of them for the well-being of the empire. This, I don't think, is an uncommon theme for God's people. It's a common theme for the Jewish people. Century after century after century, some sort of Holocaustal, genocidal nonsense pops up for them. No matter where they go, no matter what they do, they are different. And that difference often results in mistreatment, sometimes ultimately. As Christians, we experience a similar thing. Now, it's a little bit difficult for us European Christians because we've had almost millennia of Christian faith being the dominant sort of worldview and religious system. And so now as we are entering into sort of a post-Christendom, or have entered into a post-Christendom situation, I think perhaps we can recognize this a little bit differently. These Christians don't think the way we think. They don't do the things we do. They don't approve of the same things we approve of, and they disapprove of things we don't disapprove of. And we can't be having them operating freely and without consequence in our environment. So we need to get rid of them. And it might not be an outright get rid of some sort of genocidal thing like Haman has in mind. But it might be a we need to get them out of the government, off our school boards, out of our communities, away from children and vulnerable adults, because they threaten that which gives cohesion and peace in our place. So actually, this story isn't quite different. We can even think of a few things even now. We're holding to the teaching of the scriptures that has been Christian teaching for thousands of years on a lot of different topics. Standing firm on that would be like, actually, you are disruptive. You are against the common good. You are not for the common good. You need to go over here. Don't look over there. Don't pay attention to them. They're social terrorists. They will undermine our social fabric. I don't think I'm overstating. Am I overstating? I don't think I'm overstating. You may or may not agree with me on that. That's okay. So King Xerxes says to Haman, "Do as you please." Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal decrees were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles and the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as a law in every province and made known to the people of every nation or every nationality, so they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. In that last chunk, it's quite over the top. Every nation, every satrap, every governor, every nationality, it's quite over the top to make that point. Oh, you can take the map down, Zeke, if you'd like. Sorry, it's been up for a while. Appreciate that. But there's this thing, and it's absolutely ubiquitous. And here's the weird thing about being God's people. And I just want to notice a couple different things. One is God enfolds a bit more in his people than sometimes we might immediately recognize. Normally, we recognize those who we're most familiar with. If you're a Jew in Jerusalem and after the exile, we're like, no, we're the ones who are like suffering. We're fighting off the locals. We're trying to rebuild the walls, rebuild the temple, restore the kingdom of King David and the rightful worship. Like, we're the faithful ones. Well, we're the ones who have always been in the land. We're the faithful ones. Well, we're the ones who are doing the hard business. There's maybe a bit more in the camp, and as far as God is concerned, than we might immediately recognize. And that's a valuable thing to keep in mind. Secondly, God has his people in his places for a reason. We're going to get to this a little bit later. It's good to be stuck in the structures that wield influence and power. There's a reason for that. That's not a bad thing. No matter how much God might laugh at the nations, scoff at the nations, make a mockery of governments and rulers and that sort of thing, that doesn't mean that he doesn't engage meaningfully with them through his people. And so engaging in voting, that matters. Engaging in democratic processes matters. It's important, and we should be encouraged to speak our voice and to make our voice and our thoughts known. Because it could be that just like Esther, Mordecai's would-be consort, hears from Mordecai and then is able to relay. We have that privileged position of being able to hear from God, from his word, by his spirit, and from each other, to hear from God and then relay that useful information to the world around us. Thirdly, no matter how much we might seek to be a blessing to the world around us, we are, by nature, different. And that difference will come around and bite us. And people will seek to destroy us because our difference, no matter how much it might be a blessing to the world, is still going to undermine the authority of the world that is not in submission to God. And as we undermine that authority, even while seeking its blessing, that will come around and get after us from time to time. And we need to be expectant of that. And ultimately, this is no different than the life of our very own Lord Jesus Christ of Nazareth. You know? God's son, though not necessarily who or what we may have expected to be God's son. An absolute blessing in his world and to his community. Nevertheless, his difference resulted in his crucifixion. And so all we're doing is seeing Jesus in the book of Esther, seeing ourselves in the book of Esther. And I want us to be encouraged and not caught off guard when, not if, when, the kinds of things that we read about in Esther we experience in our own lives. And know that when we do, we're not being like Esther, we're not being like Mordecai, we're not being like the Jewish people. In fact, we're living a life like Jesus's. We're being Christians, little Christs out in God's world. So in a moment, we're gonna sing and then we're gonna have a time of confession. And as you think about confession, there might be something completely unrelated to anything we've talked about. You're like, I just need to offer God my stuff. Remember last week, we talked about Esther and King Xerxes. And perhaps she became queen, not his wife, but queen, not because she was so skillful that evening, okay? But because she was a safe place for Xerxes' shame, his impotence, his embarrassment. And so she was more beautiful than anybody else. And so and we're able to do that. We're able to be that safe place of hospitality for others because we've experienced that safety and hospitality from God. So there might be something where it's like, I've got some shame I need to offer to God. I've got some impotence. Something I wasn't able to do that I should have done. Or whatever. It could be that something we've talked about this morning, you're like, actually, God's people, there's probably a broader swath of who is God's people that God is bringing together. I probably need to think about that maybe a little bit more generously and find out, actually, what are the boundaries? I just need to think about that. Maybe repent of some judgmentalism or repent of, like, we're all God's children. Well, no, there's we're all God's children, but we're not all God's people. That make sense? Maybe there's something of actually engaging meaningfully. You're like, I'm actually quite passive. I need to step in and engage meaningfully in my world and be a blessing. And maybe it's like, but anytime I think that's going to be costly, I shrink back. And I need to sort of come to a disposition that welcomes that. Not that I want it. Not that I'm inviting it. But when it comes to me, like I'm ready to welcome it. And I'm not going to make certain decisions simply to avoid that mistreatment any more than Jesus made certain decisions in order to avoid his crucified shame and death. Trusting in God's vindication. We're going to read more about that in Esther. All right, so let's stand. With that stuff in mind, let's stand as the team comes up to lead us in some responsive worship.